When a billionaire's plane crashes in a remote village, he's saved by a selfless local woman who changes his world forever. Their unlikely bond blossoms into a love that defies societal boundaries. But can their hearts bridge the gap between two vastly different worlds? This story will leave you breathless. Alexander Steele was the kind of man who could make empires tremble with a single phone call. In his mid-30s, he had everything most people dreamed of: sprawling estates, private jets, and a name that commanded power. Yet behind the Steele facade lay a man unacquainted with true connection. His life was a symphony of boardrooms and business deals, a rhythm that left no space for vulnerability. The day began like any other for Alexander. He was scheduled to attend a high-stakes business meeting that could seal his next multi-billion-dollar deal. Dressed in a tailored suit and exuding his trademark confidence, he boarded his private jet. The sky was overcast, but his focus remained glued to the digital tablet in his hands, scanning numbers and projections. The brewing storm outside seemed like a mere inconvenience. As the jet climbed higher, turbulence shook the cabin violently. The pilot's confident assurances over the intercom did little to quell the growing unease. And then it happened. A deafening crack of lightning struck one of the engines, followed by an ominous alarm. Chaos erupted as the jet plunged. For the first time in years, Alexander's heart raced, not from ambition, but from pure, unfiltered fear. The last thing he remembered was the earth-shattering sound of impact, and the eerie silence that followed. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth after rain. Lila trudged through the dense forest, a basket slung over her shoulder as she gathered herbs and roots. Her life in the remote village was simple yet demanding. With her mother bedridden and the villagers relying on her for remedies, she bore the weight of countless responsibilities. Her sharp eyes caught a strange glint through the trees, a reflection where there should have been none. Cautiously she approached, her breath catching at the sight before her. The wreckage of a plane lay sprawled across the clearing, jagged metal twisted into grotesque shapes. Amid the debris, a figure lay motionless. Lila's heart pounded as she stepped closer. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but compassion anchored her feet. The man was alive, his face streaked with blood, his breathing shallow. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "Sir, can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice urgent yet gentle. Alexander stirred faintly, a groan escaping his lips. Lila assessed his injuries with the practiced precision of someone who had seen more hardship than most. His left leg was bruised, possibly fractured, and a deep gash marred his temple. Summoning her courage, Lila fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and her shawl. The journey back to the village was grueling. The man's weight pressed down on her slight frame, but she didn't stop. The storm clouds above mirrored the turmoil within her, but one thing was clear: leaving him there would have been a death sentence. Lila's home was modest, a single-room hut with earthen walls and a thatched roof. She laid Alexander on the wooden cot, her fingers working quickly to clean his wounds. Her remedies were a mix of herbs and poultices passed down through generations, their efficacy proven time and again. As she applied a compress to his head, she paused, studying his face. His features, though bruised, bore a striking handsomeness, a sharp jawline, high cheekbones, and an air of authority even in unconsciousness. "Who are you, and what brought you here?" she murmured, her voice soft, but filled with curiosity. The man stirred again, his eyelids fluttering open to reveal stormy grey eyes. For a moment, they locked onto hers, confusion and pain mingling in his gaze. "Where am I?" he croaked, his voice weak yet commanding. "You're safe," Lila reassured him, her tone firm but kind. "You were in a plane crash. I found you in the forest." Alexander's mind reeled, fragments of the crash flashing back. His first instinct was to demand his phone, to call for help, but the realization hit him like a second crash. He was utterly cut off. As he slipped back into unconsciousness, Lila sat beside him, her heart heavy with questions. She didn't know who he was or why fate had brought him to her doorstep. But one thing was certain. She couldn't let him face this alone. Alexander woke to the sound of soft humming, a tune unfamiliar yet comforting. His eyes fluttered open, taking in the modest surroundings. A small wooden room with earthen walls, lit by sunlight streaming through a single window. The air smelled of herbs and earth, a sharp contrast to the sterile, high-tech world he was accustomed to. He groaned, attempting to sit up, but pain shot through his body, forcing him back down. "You're awake," a soft yet firm voice said. Turning his head, he saw Lila standing by a table, grinding herbs in a mortar. She looked up, her hazel eyes warm but filled with quiet strength. Her dark hair was tied back, though a few loose strands framed her face. She wasn't dressed in luxury, just a simple cotton dress, but there was an elegance in her simplicity that Alexander couldn't quite place. Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, each word scraping against his throat. "In my home," she replied, walking over to him with a cup of water. "You were in a plane crash. I found you and brought you here." He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The touch, though accidental, sent a strange jolt through him, an unfamiliar warmth. But his gratitude was quickly overshadowed by frustration. "Why didn't you take me to a hospital? I could have called someone." Lila raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his tone. "The nearest hospital is a day's journey, and you were barely breathing. You're lucky to be alive." Alexander's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, least of all by someone who lived in such simplicity. His eyes roamed the room again. The lack of modern conveniences, the small hearth, the shelves lined with jars of dried herbs. Everything about it felt alien, and he hated it. On the first few days were torturous. Alexander's injuries kept him bedridden, dependent on Lila for everything. She brought him food, simple yet nourishing meals of lentils, rice, and freshly baked bread, and tended to his wounds with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with her no-nonsense demeanour. But Alexander wasn't an easy patient. His frustration often boiled over into sharp remarks. "Do you always live like this?" he asked one evening, gesturing to the modest room. "No electricity? No running water? How do you even survive?" Lila paused, a flicker of irritation crossing her face, though her voice remained calm. "We survive because we work hard and take care of each other. Maybe that's something you're not familiar with." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. Alexander had spent his life building an empire, yet here was a woman who seemed to find strength in things he had always dismissed as insignificant. As the days passed, Alexander began observing Lila more closely. She would rise at dawn, her movements swift and efficient as she prepared meals, tended to her small vegetable garden, and cared for her ailing mother. Her mother, an elderly woman with a gentle smile, often spoke to Alexander in a language he didn't understand, but her kindness was universal. One afternoon, Alexander watched as Lila helped a neighbour repair a broken roof. She climbed with ease, her laughter ringing out as she reassured the worried villager below. Her selflessness was unlike anything he had encountered before. Something shifted in him that day. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a pang of admiration. And his physical recovery mirrored his emotional growth. With Lila's encouragement, he began moving around the small home, hesitantly at first, then with increasing confidence. One morning she handed him a broom, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "If you're well enough to walk, you're well enough to help," she said. Alexander stared at the broom as if it were a foreign object. "You expect me to clean?" "Think of it as therapy," she replied, her tone light but challenging. To his own surprise, he found himself sweeping the floor. It wasn't the grueling task he imagined. It was almost meditative. And when Lila passed by with an approving nod, he felt an odd sense of accomplishment. Their interactions grew warmer, tinged with a subtle tension neither acknowledged. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Alexander found himself sitting outside with Lila. She was weaving a basket, her fingers deft and graceful. "You don't resent this life?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. She glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. "Resent it? It's not perfect, but it's mine. I find joy in the small things, like sunsets like these." Alexander followed her gaze to the horizon, the beauty of the moment striking him in a way it never had before. "I've spent my whole life chasing things, money, power, but I don't think I've ever stopped to look at a sunset." Lila's eyes softened, her usual guarded expression giving way to something more vulnerable. "Maybe you've been chasing the wrong things." Their gazes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. Alexander felt something stir deep within him, a longing he couldn't quite name. By the end of the week, Alexander had become a reluctant but willing participant in village life. He helped Lila carry water from the nearby stream, repaired a broken fence, and even learned to cook a basic meal under her watchful eye. The man who once commanded entire industries now found joy in the simplest of tasks. And with each passing day, he found himself drawn more and more to Lila, not just her beauty, but her strength, her resilience, and the way she made him feel seen in a way no one ever had before. The morning sun filtered through the wooden slats of Lila's modest home as Alexander paced back and forth, his phone finally flickering to life with a faint signal. After days of isolation, he had managed to find just enough connectivity to make a call. His tone was sharp, commanding, as he barked orders into the device. "I don't care how you do it. Find the wreckage, send a rescue team, and get me out of here," he snapped, his voice laced with impatience. "Yes, I'm alive, but I need my lawyers to handle the press. Keep this quiet, or it'll tank the stock price, and get the jets ready for my return." From the doorway, Lila stood frozen, her basket of herbs slipping from her hands as his words reached her ears. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the urgency in his tone had caught her attention. Alexander Steele, billionaire. The realization struck her like a cold gust of wind. It all made sense now, the arrogance, the way he carried himself, even his frustration with her simple lifestyle. But what unsettled her most wasn't his wealth. It was the divide it created between them, a chasm so vast she couldn't imagine crossing it. Later that day, Alexander found her by the stream, her hands working rhythmically as she washed clothes. The tension between them was palpable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. "You heard me, didn't you?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Lila didn't look up. "I did." He stepped closer, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had suddenly formed. "Lila, I owe you my life. When I leave, I'll make sure you're compensated. Whatever you need, money, resources, a better home, it's yours." She stopped washing, her hands still submerged in the water. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes filled with a quiet fire. "Do you think I helped you for a reward?" Alexander faltered, unprepared for the weight of her words. "No, I thought—" "You thought money could fix everything," she interrupted, her tone steady but laced with hurt. "I don't need your wealth, Alexander. What I did because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something in return." Her words struck him harder than he expected, leaving him momentarily speechless. He had spent his life surrounded by people who measured worth in dollar signs, yet here was someone who saw beyond that, a perspective he found both humbling and unsettling. As the days passed, the tension between them lingered, but it also gave way to something deeper. Alexander found himself drawn to Lila's integrity, her unwavering sense of self. She, in turn, began to see glimpses of a man beneath the layers of wealth and power. A man who, despite his flaws, was capable of growth. One evening, as the village gathered around a bonfire, Alexander found himself sitting beside Lila. The crackling flames illuminated her face, and he couldn't help but notice how the firelight danced in her eyes. "I didn't mean to offend you," he said quietly, breaking the silence between them. She looked at him, her expression softening. "I know, but you have to understand, my world and yours. They're so different." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I'm starting to realize that. But maybe different doesn't have to mean impossible." Lila's breath caught at his words, the sincerity in his voice stirring something deep within her. She wanted to believe him, but the reality of their differences loomed large. And that night, as they walked back to her home, a sudden rainstorm swept through the village. Laughing despite themselves, they hurried under the shelter of a large tree. Water dripped from the leaves above, and Alexander glanced at Lila, her hair damp and her cheeks flushed. "I don't think I've ever been caught in the rain like this," he admitted, his voice tinged with wonder. Lila laughed, a sound that sent a warmth through him. "You've been missing out." Their laughter faded, leaving only the sound of rain and the steady rhythm of their breaths. Alexander reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. His fingers lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and their eyes met, the air between them thick with unspoken emotions. "Lila," he began, his voice low. "I don't know how to explain this, but you've changed something in me." Her heart pounded, torn between the feelings she couldn't deny and the fears she couldn't ignore. "Alexander, our worlds—" "I don't care about our worlds," he interrupted gently. "All I know is that, for the first time in my life, I've found something real. And I don't want to lose it." His words hung in the air, and for a brief, fleeting moment it felt as if the rain itself paused, waiting for her response. But Lila couldn't bring herself to answer. Instead, she stepped away, her heart heavy with both hope and uncertainty. The weeks melted into one another, each day drawing Alexander deeper into the rhythms of the village. The days were filled with tasks that had once seemed mundane to him, but now carried an unexpected joy. Fetching water from the stream, helping repair huts, and sharing meals under the open sky. All of it felt strangely liberating. The simplicity was disarming, and for the first time in years, he felt unburdened by the constant demands of his old life. But it was Lila who captivated him the most. One afternoon, as they sat by the stream, Alexander watched her with quiet admiration. She was weaving a basket, her fingers deft and precise. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow on her face. He noticed the way her brow furrowed slightly in concentration, the way her lips curved into a faint smile as she worked. "You're good at that," he said, breaking the silence. Lila glanced up, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "It's nothing special, just something I've done all my life." "It's more than that," he replied, his tone sincere. "You make it look effortless." She gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "You're full of compliments today." "It's not flattery, it's the truth," he said softly, his gaze lingering on her. The moment hung between them, unspoken words filling the air. As their connection deepened, Alexander began to learn more about the woman who had saved his life. One evening, as they sat by the fire in her home, he asked, "Why do you live here, Lila?" "A woman like you. You could have done anything, been anywhere." She hesitated, her fingers playing with the edge of her shawl. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. "Why not?" he pressed gently. Lila took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "I was engaged once," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "To a man from a nearby town. We were supposed to start a new life together, but he left. Said I wasn't enough for the life he wanted." Alexander's chest tightened at her words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "It was a long time ago. But people talk, you know? In a place like this, they never let you forget. A broken engagement. It's a stain that doesn't wash away. Her gaze dropped to her lap. And then my mother fell ill. Taking care of her became my life. I stayed because she needed me, because this is home, but sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to leave, to see the world beyond these mountains. Her vulnerability struck a chord in Alexander, and for a moment he was at a loss for words. He reached out, his hand covering hers. You've given so much, Lila, more than most people ever would. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you extraordinary. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. As their evenings turned into quiet conversations, Lila began to learn more about Alexander as well. One night, as they sat under the stars, she asked, "What about you? You've told me about your business, your travels, but what about your life? The person behind the billionaire." He hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. "It's not much of a life," he admitted. "Why do I find that hard to believe?" she teased gently. He gave a hollow laugh. "Because you've seen the surface, the jets, the power, the success. But that's all it is. A surface." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I was married once. It didn't last. She said I cared more about my work than I did about her, and she wasn't wrong." Lila's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. "That must have been hard." "It was," he admitted. "But the truth is, I didn't know how to be what she needed. I built walls around myself because it was easier than letting someone in. And in the end, I lost her, just like I've lost everyone who ever tried to get close to me." There was a vulnerability in his words that Lila hadn't seen before, and it stirred something deep within her. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "You're not that man anymore, Alexander. I've seen it. You're learning to let those walls down." Her words hung in the air, and Alexander turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "And that's because of you, Lila," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me a life I never knew I wanted. A life that feels real." And their connection grew stronger with each passing day, their shared stories and quiet moments weaving a bond that neither could ignore. But beneath the growing warmth lay the unspoken question of what would happen when their worlds inevitably collided again. For now, though, they clung to the present, savouring the fleeting moments of peace and connection that had brought them together. But the early morning sun cast a golden hue over the village as Alexander sat outside Lila's home, sipping a cup of her freshly brewed herbal tea. Life here had become almost second nature to him, something he never would have imagined weeks ago. But this morning felt different. There was an unease in the air, as if something was about to change, as if on cue, the faint sound of a helicopter echoed in the distance. Alexander's heart quickened. He pulled out the small radio device he'd kept close since regaining some signal. Moments later, a static-filled voice confirmed his suspicion. "Mr. Steele, the rescue team is en route. ETA, 48 hours. We'll find you." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Alexander set the radio down, his gaze drifting toward the stream where Lila was washing vegetables. He should have felt relief, joy even, at the thought of returning to his life. But all he felt was a hollow ache. That evening, Lila noticed his unusual silence. They sat by the fire as they had so many nights before, but Alexander seemed lost in thought. Finally, she asked, "What's wrong?" He hesitated, unsure of how to say the words. "The rescue team. They're coming. 2 days from now." Her hands stilled on the basket she was weaving. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "That's good news. You'll be going home." The words felt like a knife to his chest. "Lila." He trailed off, unsure of what to say. The weight of all the unspoken moments between them suddenly felt unbearable. Lila forced a smile, though her heart ached. "You've been wanting this, haven't you? To go back to your life?" He nodded slowly. "I thought I did. But now, I don't know. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the basket. You don't belong here, Alexander. You never did. And yet, I've felt more at home here than I ever have anywhere else, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. The fire crackled between them, but neither spoke again. The silence was heavy with all the things they couldn't bring themselves to say. And the next morning, the village was awakened by frantic shouts. A storm had swept through the nearby mountains, causing a landslide that had blocked the main water source. The stream that the villagers depended on for drinking water, cooking, and irrigation was now a muddy trickle. Panic spread quickly, and Lila's face was etched with worry. If we can't clear it soon, we'll have no water for days, she said, gathering a small group of villagers to assess the damage. Alexander followed her, determination burning in his chest. When they reached the site, the scale of the problem was staggering. Large boulders and debris clogged the stream, and the villagers looked on helplessly. We can't do this alone, one of the elders said, shaking his head. Alexander stepped forward. We don't have to. We'll work together. Lila glanced at him, surprised. Alexander, no, he interrupted, his voice firm. I'm not just going to sit back and watch. We can clear this. We just need a plan. And under Alexander's direction, the villagers organized into teams. He used his business acumen to assign roles and strategize the work, turning what could have been chaos into a coordinated effort. He worked alongside them, his hands blistered from moving rocks, his shirt soaked with sweat. When one of the children tripped and scraped their knee, he paused to comfort them, his voice gentle as he reassured them it would be okay. Lila watched him in awe. This was not the man she had rescued weeks ago, a cold, arrogant billionaire. This was someone who had learned to care, to lead with heart instead of power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the villagers finally managed to clear the blockage. Water began to flow again, and a cheer erupted. Alexander stood among them, a tired but genuine smile on his face. You did it, Lila said softly, stepping up beside him. We did it, he corrected, his eyes locking with hers. On that night, the village celebrated with a feast. Lila sat beside Alexander, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and confusion. She couldn't ignore the way her feelings for him had deepened, nor could she deny the truth. They were from two different worlds. As the celebration wound down, Alexander pulled her aside. They stood under the stars, the distant hum of laughter fading into the background. Lila, he began, his voice filled with urgency. I don't want to leave you behind. Her breath hitched, and she shook her head. You don't mean that? I do, he insisted. This place, these people, you've changed me. I don't know how to go back to my life and pretend none of this ever happened. Pretend you didn't happen. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Alexander, what happens when you leave, when the world pulls you back into its chaos? People like me, we're just a passing moment for people like you. He stepped closer, his hands gently cupping her face. You're not a moment, Lila. You're the only thing that's felt real in my entire life. His words broke through her defenses, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe them. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding as he pressed his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered, or let me stay. I don't care about the logistics, about the complications. I just care about you. Lila closed her eyes, torn between her fears and the undeniable pull of her heart. The world seemed to fade around them, leaving only the two of them under the endless sky. The village was unusually quiet that evening, the air heavy with the bittersweet anticipation of Alexander's departure. Lila moved around her small home, her hands busy with mundane tasks, though her mind was far from calm. She knew he would leave the next day, and despite her efforts to steel herself, the thought sent a dull ache through her chest. Alexander, too, felt the weight of the moment as he stood outside, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of amber and gold. The simple beauty of the scene had become familiar to him. And yet, tonight it felt like a goodbye. He turned slightly, hearing Lila's soft footsteps approach behind him. "You're quiet tonight," she said gently, her voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Just thinking," he replied. Lila stepped closer, folding her arms against the cool evening breeze. "About going back?" He hesitated, then nodded. "About everything. About how much this place has changed me. How much you've changed me." Her heart skipped at his words, but she forced herself to remain composed. "You'll go back and life will move on. That's how it's supposed to be." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Is it?" "Because for the first time, I'm not sure I want to go back to the life I had." Lila looked away, her throat tightening. "You don't mean that." "I do," he said firmly, stepping closer. "Lila, I've spent my entire life chasing things I thought would make me happy. Money, power, success. But none of it ever felt like this." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his. "Like what?" "Like you," he admitted, his voice soft yet unwavering. "You've shown me what it means to care, to connect, to live, and I'm terrified of losing that." And the words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Lila's heart swelled with conflicting feelings, hope, fear, longing. "Alexander," she began, her voice trembling, "we come from different worlds. You don't belong here, and I could never belong there." "Who says we have to fit into those worlds?" he countered. "Maybe we can make our own." Her breath hitched at the raw vulnerability in his words, but she shook her head. "It's not that simple. You'll go back and you'll be pulled into that life again. And I'll still be here, in this village, living the only life I've ever known." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing against hers. "Lila, I don't want to forget this. I don't want to forget you." Her tears spilled over, and she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "You won't forget. Not if it meant as much to you as it did to me." Inside the house, Lila reached for a small box on a shelf. From it, she pulled out a simple yet delicate bracelet made of braided threads. It was adorned with tiny beads and a single charm, a small, intricately carved wooden bird. She turned it over in her hands, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "This," she said, holding it out to him, "was my mother's. She gave it to me when I was little, to remind me to stay strong no matter what life threw at me." Alexander took the bracelet, his fingers brushing hers, and looked at it with reverence. "Lila, I can't take this. It means too much to you." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want you to have it, so you'll remember this place, so you'll remember me." His throat tightened, and he closed his hand around the bracelet, feeling the weight of her words. "I could never forget you, Lila," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The night deepened, and they sat by the fire in silence, the unspoken words filling the space between them. Alexander reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. "Lila," he murmured, his voice trembling. "If I had met you in another life, another time, maybe things could have been different." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "Maybe," she whispered. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, their foreheads resting against each other's, their breaths mingling in the quiet night. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the bittersweet inevitability of their parting. And the next morning, Alexander stood at the edge of the village, the rescue team waiting in the distance. Lila stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly, as if bracing herself against the cold. "This isn't goodbye," he said, his voice resolute. Lila gave him a sad smile, her eyes glistening. "Goodbye doesn't always mean forever." He took one last lingering look at her before stepping away, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was leaving behind. As the helicopter lifted him into the sky, Alexander clutched the bracelet in his hand, vowing that he would find a way back to her, no matter how impossible it seemed. And as Lila watched him disappear into the horizon, she whispered softly to herself, "I'll never forget you, Alexander Steele." The towering skyscrapers of Alexander's city rose high above the bustling streets, their gleaming facades a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity of Lila's village. But as Alexander sat in the corner office of his sprawling corporate headquarters, overlooking the city below, he felt none of the satisfaction he once did. The familiar rhythms of his old life, the endless meetings, the lavish events, the pursuit of deals, now felt hollow. The hum of wealth and power that had once driven him seemed distant, overshadowed by the memories of a village nestled in the mountains and a woman whose presence had changed him irrevocably. Alexander found himself scrolling through photos of his time in the village, the images stark against the sleek glow of his tablet, pictures of the villagers smiling, of the lush landscapes, and of Lila, caught candidly as she laughed during one of their conversations by the stream. His thumb hovered over the bracelet she had given him, now wrapped securely around his wrist beneath his tailored suit sleeve. Every time he looked at it, he felt the weight of her words. "I want you to have it, so you'll remember. Me." Determined to honor what she had taught him, Alexander began to make changes. He launched a new initiative through his company, funding rural development projects. Clean water systems, schools, and medical facilities were just the start. He poured his resources into programs that mirrored the resilience and resourcefulness he had seen in Lila and her village. His board members questioned his sudden shift in focus, but he silenced them with a simple statement. Sometimes, you have to stop thinking about profits and start thinking about purpose. Meanwhile, in the village, Lila carried on with her life, though her heart often wandered to thoughts of Alexander. The bracelet she had given him felt like a missing piece of her, but she took comfort in knowing it was with him. Her days were filled with familiar routines, caring for her mother, tending to the garden, and helping her neighbors. But every so often she would find herself pausing, gazing at the horizon as if expecting to see him return. The challenges of her world had not lessened. The village faced an unusually harsh winter, and resources were stretched thin. Lila worked tirelessly, organizing food distributions and ensuring that everyone had enough to get by. Her strength became a beacon of hope for those around her. Though the work was exhausting, she found solace in the lessons Alexander had left behind, to lead with compassion and to never underestimate her own resilience. Months passed, and Alexander's efforts began to bear fruit. News of his philanthropic projects spread, earning him a reputation not just as a billionaire, but as a man with a vision for change. Yet, despite the accolades, his heart remained restless. One evening, as he walked through the lavish halls of his penthouse, his gaze fell on a painting he had commissioned, an abstract rendition of a mountain stream, reminiscent of the one where he and Lila had spent so many quiet moments. He knew he couldn't stay away any longer. Lila was standing by the stream one crisp morning, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she washed vegetables in the icy water. The village had begun to recover from the harsh winter, but her thoughts remained heavy with unanswered questions. She heard the faint hum of an engine before she saw it. Looking up, her heart stopped as she spotted a sleek helicopter descending in the distance, its blades cutting through the quiet air. The villagers began to gather, murmuring in curiosity as the helicopter landed on a flat stretch of ground. And then, stepping out in a simple jacket and boots, was Alexander Steele. Her breath caught as their eyes met across the crowd. Time seemed to freeze as he approached, his expression unreadable but his gaze locked on hers. "Lila," he said softly when he finally stood before her. She searched his face, her emotions a storm of surprise, disbelief, and an overwhelming wave of relief. "What are you doing here?" He smiled faintly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I told you this wasn't goodbye, I couldn't stay away." Her heart raced as she tried to process his words. But your life, your world, none of it means anything without you, he interrupted gently, stepping closer. I've tried to go back, Lila, tried to live the life I thought I wanted, but all I've done is think about you, about this place, about the way you made me see the world differently. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Alexander, I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, he replied, his voice almost a whisper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bracelet she had given him. This has been with me every day since I left. It's reminded me of what truly matters, of the person who taught me how to be better. He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. I don't care about the challenges, the differences. I just know I don't want to live a life without you in it. I'm here, Lila, and I'm not leaving until you believe that. Lila stared at him, her heart full and her walls slowly crumbling. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the depth of his transformation. And in that moment she knew that no matter how different their worlds were, the bond they shared was something rare and worth fighting for. With a trembling smile, she said, "You're stubborn, you know that?" He grinned, a boyish charm breaking through his seriousness. "I've heard that before." And as the villagers looked on, Alexander and Lila stood together by the stream, their connection unspoken but undeniable, a testament to the power of love and the courage to defy the odds. To the village gathered around Alexander and Lila, murmurs of curiosity and excitement rippling through the crowd. Lila's heart raced as she stood before him, torn between disbelief and an overwhelming sense of joy. He had returned as he promised, but the weight of their worlds felt heavier than ever. "Alexander," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "you don't understand what you're asking. This, us, it's not as simple as you think." He stepped closer, his grey eyes filled with determination. "I know it's not simple, Lila. Nothing worth having ever is. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes." She looked away, the vulnerability in her eyes betraying the battle raging within her. "What about your life? Your responsibilities? People will talk, Alexander. They'll judge you for choosing someone like me." "And what about you?" he countered gently. "What will they say about you being with someone like me? I've thought about this every day, Lila. I've weighed the risks, the challenges. None of it matters if it means losing you." And that evening, as the villagers returned to their homes, Alexander and Lila found themselves alone by the stream. The moon cast a soft glow over the water, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Lila sat on the edge of a large rock, her arms wrapped around her knees as Alexander settled beside her. "I've spent my whole life worrying about what people think," Lila admitted, her voice trembling. "This village, it's all I've ever known. It's safe, even when it's hard. But you're everything I've never had, everything I've never dared to dream of. And that terrifies me." Alexander reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Lila, you've shown me what it means to live a life of meaning. I want to build that life with you. I don't care if it's here, in the city, or somewhere in between. I just know I want it to be with you." She looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of her decision. "How can you be so sure?" He smiled softly, his gaze unwavering. "Because you're the first person who's ever seen me for who I really am. Not the billionaire, not the businessman, just Alexander. And for the first time, I like who I am because of you." Her tears spilled over, and she shook her head, a small, shaky laugh escaping her lips. "You're impossible, you know that." "I've been told," he replied with a grin, his fingers brushing away her tears. "But I'm also persistent, and I'm not leaving until you say yes." Lila stared at him, the warmth in his eyes melting the last of her doubts. Slowly she nodded, her voice soft but sure. "Yes, Alexander, I'll take a chance on us." And the next morning, the village awoke to a sight they would never forget. Alexander, with the help of the villagers, had transformed the clearing near the stream into a breathtaking scene. Strings of lights hung between trees, wildflowers adorned makeshift tables, and a small stage had been constructed from wooden planks. Lila was led to the clearing by one of the village children, her curiosity turning to astonishment as she saw the setup. Alexander stood at the center, dressed in simple but elegant clothes, holding a bouquet of freshly picked flowers. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "It's a promise," he said, stepping toward her. "A promise that I'll do whatever it takes to make this work, that I'll fight for us, for this life we've found together." The villagers cheered as Alexander took her hand and led her to the center of the clearing. Music began to play, a soft, lilting tune carried by a small group of local musicians. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. Lila laughed, a sound full of joy and disbelief, and placed her hand in his. "You're unbelievable. And you're irresistible," he replied, pulling her close as they swayed under the canopy of lights. Months later, Alexander and Lila stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony of a new community centre in the village. It was the first of many projects they had spearheaded together, combining his resources with her insight into the needs of her people. Their life was a delicate balance, a home in the village where they found peace and purpose, and a connection to the city where Alexander continued his work, reshaped by the lessons he had learned. The villagers, once hesitant, now embraced Alexander as one of their own, and as they watched the couple laugh and work side by side, their story became an inspiration to everyone who heard it, a testament to the power of love, growth, and the courage to bridge even the widest divides. As the sun set over the village, Alexander turned to Lila, his hand entwined with hers. "Do you think we've found it?" "Found what?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. "Everything we didn't know we were looking for," he said with a smile. Lila leaned into him, her heart full. "Yes, Alexander, I think we have." And as they stood together watching the sky turn to gold, they knew their love had not only changed their lives, but also left an indelible mark on the world around them.